I'm making entry. All right.
I'm right behind you.
Go.
Go.
All right.
We got some down.
Two down.
Say that, police.
Murder suspect released on bond kills whole family. True crime documentary. Sometimes violence doesn't arrive suddenly. It builds quietly, moving from one life to the next, leaving damage behind long before anyone realizes the pattern exists. This story begins with a phone call that should never have been ignored. A woman's voice shaking, saying she is being held hostage. Then another call. Then silence. Then fire. What police would eventually uncover was not one isolated crime, but a chain reaction. Events connected by timing, opportunity, and a failure to stop danger when it first revealed itself. A murder discovered in a vacant lot. A suspect released back into the world. A family home turned into a battlefield. And a final night that collapsed into chaos, gunfire, and flames. This is not just a story about brutality, it's about escalation. About how warning signs compound when they are treated as separate incidents instead of parts of the same threat. And about how decisions made days earlier, just after midnight in early June 2022, the east side of Detroit was quiet, in the way cities get before dawn. Streets empty, porch lights glowing, the sense that nothing is supposed to happen yet. But on Lenox Street, something was already unfolding in the dark. At 2:52 a.m., a resident standing at an upstairs window noticed a white sedan stopped outside. Its trunk was open. That detail felt wrong. Seconds later, he heard a woman screaming for help as she ran down the street. Then a gunshot. Then silence. The man lifted his phone and began recording, trying to stay hidden, capturing the car with its doors still open. Moments later, a man ran back into frame, slammed the trunk shut, got into the vehicle, and drove away. Convinced he had just witnessed part of a murder, the man called 911. He described the scream, the gunshot, the open trunk, the vacant lot across the street where he could still hear movement. He waited for police to arrive. They didn't. Hours passed. The street returned to stillness. Just after noon, unsettled by the lack of response, the caller went outside to look for himself. In the vacant lot, partially hidden by tall grass and trash, he found a body. He called 911 again, this time reporting what he could see with his own eyes. When officers from Detroit Police Department arrived, they followed drag marks in the dirt from the street into the overgrowth. A shell casing was recovered near the roadway. The victim was a young woman, partially clothed, with no identification. Although a gunshot had been heard, the autopsy would later confirm she had not died from a bullet wound. Her name was Natala Morris. She was 24 years old, known to friends as Sparkles. She was outgoing, close to her siblings, and had been talking about future plans just days before she died. Her family learned the news with shock that quickly turned into disbelief. Nothing about her life suggested enemies or imminent danger. Instead, two people approached the home. His mother, Flossie Bray, and his stepfather, Robert Bray Jr. When police stopped their vehicle, they noticed Flossie was carrying a registered purple and black 9mm handgun. It was seized temporarily. She was brought in for questioning, not about Natala, but about her son's whereabouts. Flossie claimed she didn't know where Jonathan was. She downplayed his relationship with Zella. She insisted she stayed out of their business. She was released. Jonathan Welch was arrested later that same day. At booking, officers photographed him. Scratches were visible along his arms and chest. He had tattoos of the women closest to him, his mother and his girlfriend. For now, only the assault and torture charges were presented in court. DNA swabs were taken, but results would take time. Jonathan was granted bond. Within weeks, he was released back into the community, fitted with an ankle monitor, and ordered to stay at his parents' home in Harper Woods. No one yet realized how closely the first killing and what came next were about to collide. Jonathan Welch's release should have been a pause in the story. Instead, it became the hinge on which everything turned. By early July 2022, Jonathan was living at his parents' home on Kenosha Street in Harper Woods, just northeast of Detroit. He was fitted with an ankle monitor and ordered to remain at the residence. On paper, the situation looked contained. In reality, it was volatile. The man police were quietly tying to one homicide was now back inside a family home that already carried unresolved violence. Despite a restraining order, Zella Frazier, Jonathan's longtime girlfriend and the mother of his young son, was pressured into bringing their child to the house. She did not feel safe there. She had already reported being dragged from bed, threatened, and held against her will just weeks earlier. But the legal lines were blurred, and the emotional pressure was relentless. She went anyway. On July 10th, shortly after midday, the first emergency call came in. A woman whispered that she was being held hostage. She said she could not leave the house. She said Jonathan was trying to kill her. The dispatcher tried to keep her talking, asking where she was, who was with her, how long she'd been trapped. The answers were fragmented. Fear collapsed sentences into fragments. Then screaming broke through the line. The call dropped. 2 minutes later, another call came in, this one from a neighbor. A woman had collapsed into her home. There was a knife lodged in her back. When officers arrived, the scene was chaotic. The injured woman was identified as Flossie Bray, Jonathan's mother. She was bleeding heavily, barely able to speak. Through gasps, she said her son had stabbed her. But she could not clearly identify which house she had run from. Neighbors stood outside, unsure where the violence was still unfolding. Officers began knocking on doors, asking residents to identify Flossie's home. One pointed to a greenhouse nearby. Blood was visible on the doorframe. That confirmation changed everything. Officers realized they were dealing with an active, unfolding threat. As Flossie was loaded into an ambulance, responders faced a terrifying uncertainty. They knew at least one person inside the house had already been attacked. They knew a child might still be inside. They did not know if the suspect was armed, how many victims remained, or whether the situation was escalating. Then they saw smoke. Officers positioned outside the house noticed movement through the windows, and flames beginning to build toward the back of the structure. Someone had set a fire in the kitchen. Firefighters were already on scene, but they were forced to hold back. Gunshots were fired from inside the house, shattering any chance of a quick rescue. At least 4 to 5 rounds were discharged through windows facing the street. 2 of those shots struck a neighboring house. At this point, the situation became a full-scale standoff. A perimeter was established. Tactical units were called in. Officers yelled commands through megaphones, but the smoke and chaos made it impossible to determine who was still alive inside. Then, from the backyard, a child appeared. Officers rushed forward and pulled the toddler to safety. He was unharmed. The relief was brief. The fate of Zella Frazier and Robert Bray Jr., Jonathan's stepfather, was still unknown. Minutes later, the front door opened. A man stepped out wearing only boxer shorts, his hands raised. Flossie's earlier statement, that her son had stabbed her, had not yet fully circulated through the responding units amid the confusion. He complied fully. He said he was unarmed. When asked who was still inside the house, he said his father and his girlfriend were inside. He claimed his stepfather had the gun. Jonathan was taken into custody and transported to the hospital for smoke inhalation. Inside the house, the fire continued to burn. For nearly 7 hours, police and fire crews waited. No more shots were fired. No movement was seen. Eventually, tactical teams began breaking windows to gain visibility. Firefighters pushed water into the structure, extinguishing the flames room by room. When the front door was finally forced open, the truth was waiting just inside. Zella Frazier was found near the entryway. She had suffered catastrophic head trauma. She was dead. Her autopsy would later reveal repeated blows from a blunt object, possibly a hammer. Robert Bray Jr. was found near the side entrance, close to where the fire had burned most intensely. He had been struck and stabbed. He was also dead. The house told its own story. Investigators recovered multiple weapons: a knife, a hammer, lighters, and a handgun. The gun matched the purple and black 9mm seized earlier from Flossie Bray. Clothing was found on the stovetop, suggesting an attempt to destroy evidence. Witnesses on the street had watched flames flare and subside repeatedly, consistent with someone actively managing the fire, rather than a single accidental ignition. Flossie Bray survived for several days in the hospital. She was placed on life support. Then she died from her injuries. What had begun as a hostage call ended as a massacre. 3 days later, Jonathan Welch sat down with detectives. At first, the interview did not address Natala Morris. Investigators focused on the events inside the Kenosha Street house. Jonathan's account was disjointed. He claimed there had been an argument between his parents over his stepfather's recent arrest. He said tensions spilled over into a physical fight. He described multiple weapons appearing in the chaos. He mentioned taking a shower shortly before things escalated. He said he did not know how the fire started. He claimed self-defense. But the physical evidence refused to bend. Forensic testing showed Jonathan's DNA on every weapon recovered. The knife pulled from his mother's back, the hammer, the handgun, and the lighters. Zella's 911 call contradicted his narrative entirely. She had told dispatchers she was hiding, that Jonathan was trying to kill her, that Flossie was protecting her. There was no evidence of a mutual fight. There was evidence of a single aggressor. Then, on August 2nd, the final piece locked into place. DNA results from Natala Morris's case came back. Jonathan Welch was a contributor to biological material found inside her Ford Focus and on her body. The timeline closed. The man who had been released on bond after a violent assault was now tied directly to a murder committed weeks earlier, and 3 more deaths that followed. Jonathan Welch was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder, along with attempted murder for firing at police officers. The pattern was no longer deniable. Violence had not exploded randomly. It had escalated. Each opportunity to stop it had been followed by release, delay, or disbelief. And by the time the system caught up, the cost had multiplied. The final reckoning would come later, but by then, 4 lives were already gone. By the time the full scope of the case came into view, investigators were no longer looking at separate incidents. They were looking at a sequence, each event feeding the next, each decision narrowing the path towards something catastrophic. What had once seemed like disconnected violence was now unmistakably linear. Detectives began assembling the timeline backward, not from the fire on Kenosha Street, but from the moment Jonathan Welch first entered Natala Morris's life. Phone records showed that Jonathan and Natala had been in contact on the day she was killed. Their communication fit a pattern seen repeatedly in her messages with other men: brief, transactional, carefully limited. What made Jonathan different was not the nature of the interaction, but the context surrounding it. Just days earlier, he had already demonstrated a capacity for extreme control and violence against Zella Frazier. That report had not been hypothetical. It had been detailed, graphic, and supported by physical evidence. Yet Jonathan was still free. Investigators now understood that Natala's murder had not occurred in a vacuum. It happened in the narrow window between Jonathan's initial assault and his eventual arrest. A window where he was angry, unstable, and increasingly reckless. The evidence suggested that after meeting Natala, something went wrong. The exact trigger may never be known, but what followed was clear. She was beaten. Her car was used. Her body was moved. And then, in a calculated effort to erase the trail, the vehicle was burned. The brutality of her killing stood in contrast to the effort put into concealing it. That contradiction mattered. It suggested someone who acted impulsively in violence, but deliberately afterward. Someone who did not plan a clean crime, but believed he could improvise his way out of consequences. That same mindset would surface again weeks later. When Jonathan was released on bond and sent to live at his parents' house, the situation was already unstable. The home was not neutral ground. It was crowded with unresolved conflict, fear, and resentment. Zella Frazier's presence there, despite a restraining order, was not a sign of reconciliation. It was a sign of pressure. Family dynamics had overridden legal boundaries, placing her back into proximity with the man who had already terrorized her. The July 10th hostage call was not sudden. It was the culmination of that pressure. Zella's words to the dispatcher were fragmented, but their meaning was unmistakable. She was trapped. She believed she was about to die. She identified Jonathan as the threat. Those statements mattered because they were made before the violence reached its peak, before memory could be distorted by trauma or survival instinct. Flossie Bray's actions that day added another layer of tragedy. At some point during the confrontation, she positioned herself between Jonathan and Zella. The evidence suggested she tried to intervene, to shield, to de-escalate. That decision nearly cost her life, and ultimately did. The injuries recovered from the house told a grim story of escalation within escalation. A knife used on one victim, a hammer used on another, a gun fired repeatedly, not just at family members but at police officers outside. This was not chaotic self-defense. It was sustained aggression across multiple phases, involving different tools, different victims, and different objectives. Fire was the final element. Investigators concluded the blaze was not accidental. It had been started deliberately, managed deliberately, and allowed to burn while officers were held at bay by gunfire. The fire served 2 purposes. It delayed intervention, and it threatened to destroy evidence. The fact that clothing was placed on the stovetop and lighters were found nearby supported the theory of intentional ignition. Jonathan's appearance at the front door, half-dressed, hands raised, momentarily disrupted the narrative. In the confusion, some officers believed he might be escaping danger rather than causing it. That hesitation likely saved him from immediate harm, but it also underscored how difficult it can be to identify the true source of violence in unfolding crises. Once in custody, Jonathan's explanation unraveled quickly. His account required too many coincidences, too many weapons appearing at once, too many injuries explained away as mutual, too much ignorance about how a fire began inside a house he was actively occupying. When investigators confronted him with the physical evidence, his DNA on every weapon, Zella's recorded 911 call, Flossie's statements, the gaps became impossible to ignore. Still, one critical question remained unanswered until August. When DNA results from Natala Morris's case were returned, the investigation reached its point of no return. Jonathan Welch was linked directly to the first murder. Biological material placed him inside her car and in contact with her body. The chain was now complete. 1 man, 4 deaths, 1 uninterrupted trajectory. Prosecutors described the case as a failure of interruption. At multiple points, there had been opportunities to stop the progression. The initial assault report, the bond decision, the delayed DNA results, the reliance on separation rather than containment. None of these failures alone caused the massacre. Together, they allowed it. As charges were finalized, Jonathan faced counts that reflected not just what he had done, but how he had done it. First-degree murder for Natala Morris, first-degree murder for Zella Frazier, first-degree murder for Flossie Bray, first-degree murder for Robert Bray Jr. Additional charges for attempted murder of police officers. Each count represented a moment when violence crossed a new line. By the time the case reached court, there was no longer a mystery to solve. The question was no longer who or how. It was whether the system could acknowledge the pattern clearly enough to prevent its repetition elsewhere. The final phase would not bring back the dead, but it would determine whether this chain of events would be remembered as an anomaly or as a warning. The final chapter of this case did not unfold with suspense. It unfolded with weight. By the time Jonathan Lamont Welch stood before the court, there was no uncertainty left to argue away. The evidence no longer pointed in multiple directions. It converged. 4 deaths, separated by weeks, bound together by the same individual, the same patterns, and the same failure to stop escalation when it was first visible. Prosecutors did not present the case as a series of shocking moments. They presented it as a progression. They began with Natala Morris, a young woman whose life had quietly shifted into a vulnerable place after losing her job. Someone navigating financial stress, private choices, and short-term connections that few people around her fully understood. On the night she died, she encountered a man who already had violence in motion. The court emphasized that Natala did not die because of who she was, but because of who Jonathan Welch already was by the time their paths crossed. Her murder was not impulsive chaos. It was a violent act followed by deliberate cleanup. Moving her body, driving her car, burning evidence. These were not the actions of someone panicking. They were the actions of someone trying to reset the narrative. Then the court turned to July 10th. Zella Frazier's 911 call was played in full. Her voice filled the courtroom. She was hiding. She said she was being held hostage. She said Jonathan was trying to kill her. Those words mattered more than any later explanation, because they were spoken in real time, without benefit of hindsight, without influence from investigators or lawyers. Flossie Bray's actions were framed not as confusion, but as courage. Evidence showed she stepped between Jonathan and Zella. She attempted to protect someone else from harm. She paid for that decision with her life. The knife in her back was not symbolic. It was literal proof of where the violence was directed. Robert Bray Jr.'s death completed the picture. He was not a bystander caught in crossfire. He was struck, stabbed, and left near the origin of the fire. The court concluded that once Jonathan lost control of the household, violence expanded outward to anyone present. The fire itself was addressed directly. Prosecutors made it clear that it was not incidental. Flames rose and fell while officers watched from outside, held back by gunfire. This was not a momentary blaze, it was a tool, used to delay, confuse, and potentially destroy evidence. Jonathan's defense attempted to frame the events as a family dispute that spiraled. But disputes do not explain multiple weapons. They do not explain DNA on every implement, They do not explain gunfire directed at police officers, and they do not explain a prior murder tied by forensic evidence. Once those results were entered, the timeline became unbroken. June 4th, July 10th. 4 victims, 1 perpetrator. No gaps. Faced with the full scope of the evidence, Jonathan Welch pleaded guilty on November 1, 2023. The sentence reflected the magnitude of the harm. 45 to 70 years in prison, effectively a life sentence. No early release, no ambiguity. The court made clear that this was not punishment for a single act, but accountability for a sustained course of violence that claimed 4 lives and endangered countless others. In the aftermath, families were left to grieve not just loss, but sequence. Natala Morris's family mourned a daughter and sister whose life ended in isolation, her final moments unseen until it was too late. Zella Frazier's family mourned a woman who tried to escape and did everything right, called for help, hid, sought protection, yet was still killed. Flossie Bray's family mourned a mother whose instinct was to shield someone else. Robert Bray Jr.'s family mourned a man who did not survive the violence inside his own home. The case forced an uncomfortable reckoning. This was not a failure of one moment, it was a failure of interruption. A violent assault was reported, a suspect was arrested, bond was granted. DNA testing took time. Warnings existed, but they were processed in isolation, instead of as part of a growing threat. Each decision, individually defensible, collectively disastrous. That is the true lesson of this case. Violence rarely announces its final form at the beginning. It escalates. It tests boundaries. It looks for gaps. And when those gaps exist, it moves through them. What happened in Harper Woods and Detroit was not inevitable. It was preventable, if the pattern had been recognized early enough. This story does not end with closure. It ends with clarity. If you've stayed with this case, let it sharpen how you see warning signs. Not as isolated incidents, but as trajectories. Share this story so others understand how escalation works. Speak about the moments that matter before they become headlines. And if you value careful, fact-driven storytelling that refuses to look away from uncomfortable truths, support it. Like the video, share it with intention,